Well, I'm tempted to just ask Jordan a question here. I mean, it's hard to know what to save for tomorrow night, but I feel like we've got 3,000 people sitting here who would really like an answer to this question. You say you believe in God. You have been...
No, I say I act as if he exists.
You say what?
I say I act as if he exists,
okay,
which is a much more precise claim.
Okay, so then what, but in this case, so you act as though God exists.
Yep.
And in addition, I've heard you say that I act as though God exists, that I can't really be an atheist.
So far it seems that.
Right, yeah.
We'll see.
The night is young.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm not really an atheist. I've heard you say this. So that
well, some of you is.
Well, if I were really an atheist, I would be far more poorly behaved than in fact I am. Right? I would be like Raskolnikov committing murders and assuming there was nothing wrong with it.
It would be more likely, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
wait, that's a big distinction.
I need to know.
Be more likely.
What was that?
It's a big distinction. That you would is very different than it would be more likely. Taking the safety off the gun is not the same thing as shooting it, right?
Yeah.
The temptations laid open to Raskolnikov would be more at hand.
Okay.
Just as they were to him.
So, in what sense do you mean? What is the God that you act as though he, she, it exists? And what is the God-shaped thing I must have in my life to prevent me from being a, quote, real atheist?
Well, okay, first of all, I have to point out that there's no possible way I can answer both those questions in 2 minutes.
What do you believe about the origin of this sacred book, the Bible, Old and New Testament? Do you believe that just maybe it has a status unlike any other book? Or is it simply old writing of human beings just like ourselves?
I think it's both.
So there's a difference between, and magic is a decent analogy, there's a difference between, like, paradoxically, real magic is fake magic, and fake magic is real magic. The only real magic in the world produced by magicians is the fake magic, where the magician, like someone like Darren Brown, will tell you, actually, no, I can't read minds, and I did put the rabbit in the hat, and this is fake, but the surprise is that even knowing it's fake, you can't understand how this effect is being achieved. Whereas the fake magicians are the ones who are pretending to be real, who are hiding, who are not acknowledging the mechanics, the real mechanics behind what is in fact effective. You know, the illusion that the rabbit pops out of the hat. And what I worry with some of the way in which you discuss the power of story, the power of metaphor, and the religious anchoring there, is that the leverage and the utility can be had even while acknowledging the real mechanics of it. You know, the fakeness of the magic, right? And you seem to suspect that it can't, that takes all of the wind out of the sails.
I'm not so sure what of it's fake and what of it isn't. Well, so I would say that I do consciously participate in the process that you described. But you see, I would also make the case, and this is certainly one of the things that we've been discussing, that you do it unconsciously. And let me make the case for that for a minute, because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'd like to see your response. So when I really read The Moral Landscape a lot, and I thought about it a lot, you know, and so this is what it looks like to me. So you make the proposition that we have to breach the gap between facts and values, because otherwise our values are left hanging unmoored, and that certainly brings about the danger of nihilism, but also a potential danger of swing to totalitarianism, something we agree about. I truly do believe that. Right. And then you perform an operation, a conceptual operation, and you say, surely we can all agree that, and then you outline a story about this woman who lives in this horrible country, who's basically just being starved and disease-ridden and tortured her whole life and having just a hell of a time of it, to put it in a phrase. Mm-hmm. And then you say, well, surely we can all agree that that's not good. And then you contrast that with, at least in principle, the sort of life that we would all like to have if we could choose the life that we have. and then you say, well, we could start with the proposition that we should move away from this terrible, hellish circumstance, and we should move towards this more ideal perspective. And you say, if we could only agree on that, then.
And I'm wondering, what percentage of religious people who would say, oh yeah, I believe in God and it's the most important thing in my life, what percentage of those religious people do you think have in mind a God of the sort you just described?
I don't know, Sam. It's a good question, because when I go talk to people, when I talk to people online and use exactly this terminology, millions of people listen. So it's not so obvious what percentage of people see it this way. It may be that they have the intuitions, but they haven't been articulated well.
I mean, this is the problem. This is what worries me about this. So
it's not, unless you're adding this other piece, which is some probabilistic claim that, yes, this book probably was dictated by an omniscient being, unlike any other book.
Well,
or maybe the Muslims are right, that Archangel Gabriel did show up to Muhammad in his cave and give him the one final revelation, never to be superseded. And just on the merits of the text, we know that's not true. We know, for all it gets wrong and all it fails to get right about the nature of our circumstance, we know that book is not the best book ever written on any topic. And here I'm speaking of the Quran, but it's true of the Bible. It's true of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. But no one's claiming that about the Meditations, and that's a crucial difference. It's a difference that explains so much unnecessary suffering in our world. And again, what I fear about the way you talk about religion is that at the end of all these conversations, I'm still not sure what you believe on that point, frankly. And if I'm not sure, no one out there is.
Well, I don't know why you would expect to be sure about what someone believes. How do you think that any one of you are capable of fully articulating what you believe?
You're making this harder than it is, and my concern is why. Right?
Well, I don't think I am, Sam, because I think that the fundamental message in the New Testament, for example, is that
so then you acknowledge that the Old Testament, so Jews are in possession of a book that has some diabolical passages that would be better left out. I say, I don't believe in ghosts, and you say, no, you do believe in ghosts. Ghosts are your relationship to the unseen. That's a ghost. So you have a new definition of ghost that you're putting in the place provided, which I have to say, well, of course I have a relationship to the unseen, so yeah, I guess I do believe in ghosts. You know, you win that argument. But that simply isn't what most people mean by a ghost. Most people
but you can't use that simplified argument about my conception of ghosts as an analogy for the propositions that I just put forward.
This is what I see you do. I mean, maybe you have more to say on the topic of God, but this is what I hear you doing with God. You have defined the God that most people believe in, and we know this is the God that most people believe in.
I was asked what God I believed in.
I'm asking you what percentage. Yes, but you by shifting the definition, you have robbed the noun, the traditional noun, of its traditional meaning, and you're imparting to people a sense.
Wait a second, people.
I'm not so
what
sure
do you mean by
this.
traditional meaning? Look.
Aren't you? You are not. That's completely ridiculous. You're not transparent to yourself by any stretch of the imagination. You act out all sorts of things that you can't articulate.
But how about a best guess? Yeah.
You know, if you look, let's go all cognitive neuroscience on this, shall we? 99% of your processing is unconscious. You're not capable of articulating yourselves. If you were, you'd be omniscient.
Okay,
but don't give me any nonsense about that.
But that is a. I've never heard so many people applaud an evasion of a simple question.
It was a good one, though.
Yeah.
It was a very good.
Okay.
Would you agree that there are things written into these religious texts that are unambiguously unacceptable viewed through a modern lens, and not because the texts are so complicated that we have misunderstood something, but there are things that are just written in there that we now understand to be wrong?
Okay, so the first thing, The first thing I would say is that we have to be very careful about equating all the religious texts. And I do actually think that you are careful about that, but that's something we can have a discussion about a little bit later.
I agree with you there.
So because, for a lot of my life, I would say, more interested in the universal truths expressed in religious belief across different cultures. But I've become more and more aware of the important distinctions between the religious cultures, maybe in the last 10 years. So it isn't clear to me that you can just throw all religious dicta in the same bucket. And there's complex reasons for that. So, and one question, which you kind of sent at Sam already, is, do you see a hierarchy of unacceptability between different religious doctrines? And I would say
yes.
You acted, okay, fine. So, okay, now, but here's an interesting issue. And I think we're starting to zero in on, we've covered what we agree on, a lot of it, but there's another thing.
Answer Brett's question, because I think it was a good one.
Sorry, I answered the first half of it, but the second part is, I think that this is where I'm going to sound like a postmodernist, which I really hate. I would say, sentence by sentence, yes, you're correct. Paragraph by paragraph, perhaps. But here's the problem with complicated texts.
Okay, so but so what does that mean? That you're saying that there's somebody who's taking dictation that is unlike any other dictation. So Homer, though creative,
Sam,
or Shakespeare, though creative, was doing something else.
It's not like we understand the sources of inspiration.
Okay, but
if you talk
everyone's
to
been inspired.
People, if you talk to creative people,
yes,
they often describe themselves as something approximating a conduit through which higher wisdom is pouring.
Again, you're dodging. Shakespeare could say that, and any writer can say that. Ultimately,
yes.
right?
And it's also the case that we would rank order those writers, which is why you pointed to Shakespeare, in terms of the generalizable validity of their revelations.
Sure.
And so, so you run into the same issue. You criticize the Bible, and look, fair enough. But you're also evading a very important issue, which is how do you quantitatively rank the contributions of literature without assuming that there's a hierarchy of revelation?
There's a hierarchy of wisdom. Sure, there's a hierarchy of human wisdom. I will grant you that every day of the week. But But we're talking about primates like ourselves having conversations.